I just got your email.
Yeah, okay, everything's good.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, everybody. So it's my great pleasure to have Marc coming here to share with us an excellent talk. So I would like to first would like to say a few words. You can see this is the EEH talk series. As you just listened to our video, so we call this EEH is launched by prestigious scientists, which means sometimes it's difficult for us to call ourselves prestigious, but I think this represents or reflects the high ambition of the editorial staff who have put lots of the effort behind in past year. So maybe it's difficult for our editor to call ourselves prestigious somehow, but I would like to say Professor Marc Cadotte is a very prestigious scientist. So I would like to briefly introduce you with Marc. He is a professor of ecology in the Department of Biological Science at the University of Toronto. He is a EIC editor-in-chief of Ecological Solutions and Evidence, and the chair of Applied Ecology Resource. He has authored more than 150 articles under the book Phylogenies in Ecology, published by Princeton University Press. He studied the links between biodiversity and ecosystem function, and his focus is how to predict and control invasive species and how environment change influences the delivery of ecosystem service. And Marc has pioneered biodiversity measures that quantify species difference. I think this is very important, and particularly in microecology. In future, I hope we can collaborate something on this kind of a topic. Marc also has over 12,000 citations and has an H index of 53, according to a Google Scholar. And maybe you know that Marc is also listed on the Web of Science top 100% most cited scientists in environmental science since 5 years ago. So Marc, so it's your turn. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you, John, for having me, for inviting me to give this lecture. I will just share my screen now. Can you let me know if you can see this okay?
Yes, I can see your screen. Yeah.
Okay. I'll get started then. Well, thank you everyone who's watching this video streaming. It's a great pleasure to be talking to everyone today, and especially a lot of my friends and colleagues in China. So I'm going to talk today about the interface between two areas that I find really quite interesting, and that's between biological invasion and urban ecosystems. These are two different and unique manifestations of human impact globally, and they're not independent. The development of cities and the movement of species around the world are intimately interconnected. And so I'm going to talk through today some broad concepts and then some specific examples of some research that we're doing, and then talk a little bit again about some broad initiatives that we're pursuing. I just want to acknowledge a number of people that have come through my lab in recent years, whose research projects form part of what I'm talking about today. So I just want to make sure I acknowledge them right away. So let's start off with the concept of a city. So a city is something that until really a few hundred years ago did not exist as a dominant feature across the world. We have now, through material and energy inputs, have created an entirely new ecosystem that has profound impacts on the natural world. This development and growth of the city has been a reflection of the growth of human populations, as well as the growth of different aspects of economies that humans participate in. So today, most humans live in cities and participate in different forms of labor than they would have in the past. And in order to bring all these people together, to house them, to feed them, to deal with waste and health and education has required a lot of infrastructure. So cities are represented by this massive investment in a physical, biological, and chemical alteration of spaces on Earth. Now, the cities that we see today represent in many ways the future of what the world could look like. So what I say is the future of the Anthropocene. We imagine a future world, maybe 100, 200 years from now, and it's likely we see landscapes or maybe the entire Earth's surface dominated by human impact, and especially by cities. And why this is important is that these cities are altering not only the ecology of the world, but the geology as well. And so one thing I like to say is that if we look to past paleontological records, we might see very common fossils like trilobites pictured here. If in the future, some paleontologist a million years from now looks through the Earth's record, doorknobs will become more common than trilobites. This is how much of an impact that humans have had in the world, is that the materials and objects that we create now are permanent, will become a permanent part of Earth's history. But more than this history is what cities do the here and now, is that they have measurable impacts on the environment, whether that is through emitting light and sound, the production and transportation of waste, contributions to air pollution through, for example, the creation of ozone, emitting particulate matter, emitting or changing chemical composition of air with sulfur and nitrogen, for example. We see cities as sources of water pollution, and all these changes, besides the physical ones to the environment, compound to have some fairly significant impacts on the biological environment. And so we know that cities do impact species in a myriad of ways. Some species, groups of species, we see massive declines in diversity. So, for example, birds, the number of bird species in cities, shown in the green color, tends to decline by about 70% with high urbanization. But the total abundance of bird species, shown in orange, typically does not change. And that's because as you move into highly urbanized areas, you tend to get a few species that are hyperabundant, like pigeons and rock doves, etc. Other species show more complex relationships with urbanization. Insects, for example, we see that some, or arthropods, we see that some groups are relatively insensitive to urbanization. Some groups may even have some benefit from urbanization, whereas others, like butterflies and beetles, seem to be quite sensitive. And still other groups, like plants, show the opposite pattern that we would see with birds, for example. That is that we see fairly substantial declines in the abundance of plants, and that's because we're removing physical space from plant growth and putting buildings on it or roads. So there's just less space for plants to occur. But we tend to see high diversity of plants because humans are importing many species through gardening and agriculture, and are maintaining a high diversity of plants artificially through our activities. And so these responses of biodiversity to urbanization highlights the complexity of these issues, the differences between taxa, the differences between different species that have different life history attributes or traits, but also the differences between species based on where they come from. And so through parts of this talk, you'll see that I use the phrase NIS to stand for non-indigenous species. And what I mean by this are just species that are exotic or alien that are brought in by humans from one location to another. And so to understand the dynamics of urbanization, we need to understand what is happening with these species that we're importing. So that are being, but we see that available evidence shows that at both the population level and the community level, we see that urbanization benefits these non-native species and non-indigenous species. So at the population level, we tend to see higher population sizes in more urbanized areas for these non-indigenous species. And at the community level, we tend to see higher diversity of non-indigenous species with greater urbanization. And this tends to be most significant for invertebrate species as well as plants. And other lines of evidence are also showing that cities tend to be hotspots for non-indigenous species. So for example, I recently compiled the list of vascular plants for the city of Toronto. And in the city of Toronto, there are over 1,900 plants recorded, but about 40% of these are non-indigenous, so they've been imported from elsewhere. When you look at the larger region, so the province of Ontario, where Toronto sits, it's only about 1/4 of the flora is non-indigenous. So we see there's this increase in a city in the proportion of non-indigenous species. So we see this hotspot. In another study, this was done in Russia, looking at cities in Russia, we also found that more than 30% of the flora of these cities were non-indigenous. And this was much, much higher than the surrounding region for these cities. So two different regions in the world, and we see the same story, that cities seem to harbor about 1/3 of their flora being non-indigenous species. So there's this intimate relationship between urbanization and the occurrence of non-indigenous species. And so why is this? Well, really, there's four main reasons why we see this relationship between non-indigenous species and urbanization. And I'll just say something about each of these four now. The first is that cities serve as a transportation network. They serve as hubs in this network. And so whether it's shipping ports or airports or rail lines or highways, is that all those things lead to cities. Cities are places where goods and people move between. And so they tend to be the places where new species are likely to get introduced accidentally. Cities are also focal points of disturbance. And so we can see in this picture here in this construction that in cities, we can constantly see examples of soil and habitat being disturbed by human activities. And what we also see is that in urban areas, places that have high disturbance tend to have lower native diversity, but they also tend to see increases in exotic or non-indigenous species diversity. So non-indigenous species become more common in places that have higher disturbance, especially in urbanized areas. Cities are also places where, especially plants, see reduced competition. Because of the way we manage space and we manage plants, we tend to reduce their competition. We remove what we consider to be weedy species or species we don't want in those systems. We tend to keep spaces between individuals rather large. We don't let those spaces fill up. So for example, if you look at these street trees on the right, you can see that there's no opportunity for new trees to germinate, emerge, and grow in this space. So these trees are basically kept free from competition. And this allows species that are just establishing to grow and to reproduce without being excluded by competition. So for example, if you look at the agriculture picture in the middle, this is corn. We know that if you were to leave this bit of land alone and allow natural succession, so colonization by other plant species, that these corn individuals would quickly disappear. They're just not competitive enough to hold on to this bit of land. So it's human activity that reduces this competition. And also cities are places that have relatively novel environmental conditions. So you take, for example, this picture and this dandelion growing in cracks between bricks in the ground. This is not a habitat condition found outside of cities. So it's supplying novel conditions that certain species may find advantageous. Most commonly, we know that cities and increasing urbanization result in increases in temperature. And this is something that's shown around the world. And so this is creating a different set of environmental conditions within regions. It's creating warmer islands that maybe provide benefit to species that are being imported from warmer climates as well, and to provide longer growing seasons, and to provide competitive advantage to those species that are better adapted to dealing with warmer or drier conditions. So we have these reasons why cities are potentially beneficial to the establishment and spread of non-native species. But it's important that we don't think of cities as a homogeneous environment, right? Cities have a lot of heterogeneity. So for example, in these photos here, we see a highly managed park, and beside it, we see a semi-natural woodland that might occur in a city. And these two different habitats within a city are going to be providing different opportunities or different filters to the establishment and spread of non-indigenous species. And so in a recent project, we thought about the ways in which different kinds of green space would interact with non-indigenous species. And we realized that in a city, green spaces differ across three main features. One is their propagule pressure, so how linked they are to the movement and spread of species, or how much humans might be introducing species to those places. Green spaces in cities may also differ in abiotic aspects. So for example, how stressed they are because of pollutants versus how intact they are. And then the final one is the biotic. So some green spaces in cities tend to have high biodiversity, high competition. Other places may be really simple systems that are maintained to be simple and have low diversity. And so across these three axes, we can actually make predictions about which green spaces are likely to be most susceptible to invasion, and also which ones require the most management to maintain them. And so what we came up with was this framework that looks across these three features: propagule pressure, abiotic, and biotic factors, and subdivides them into a number of different aspects. And so you can see is we have all these arrows, and we can tune these arrows based on what kind of green space we're dealing with. So some green spaces may be really susceptible to propagule pressure because of their linkages to other habitats. Some of them might be have really low diversity because of how they're managed. And so what you can see in these different green spaces, so UGS 1 through 4, is different types of green space. And if we know something about how they're connected, how they're managed, how they're stressed, the amount of biomass and diversity, we can make predictions about what elements of those green spaces are most susceptible to invasion. Are they susceptible to invasion because they have low competition, because they have novel environments, because they have high propagule pressure? And this can help us identify those green spaces that are likely to be hubs or nodes of invasion within a city. Even if we understand invasion in cities, it's actually really difficult to manage invasions in cities. So in natural habitats, we might be able to manage non-indigenous species because of very simple policies. or management requirements. So the simple aspect of there being the presence of a non-indigenous species, say in a protected area, would trigger some management response. In cities, it's much more complicated. And the reason is that people have perceptions about species. So people may perceive benefits from species. They may not be willing to support the management of species. And so it becomes a much more complicated thing in cities to make decisions to control species, and not only the human element, but just because of the all the different actors in a city. So some people might own land, some people might own gardens, some people might be keeping species as hobbies, and all these different people are going to be interacting with the establishment and spread of species. And it's very difficult to control people's actions. And so it's very difficult to manage these invasions. And just take, for example, the example I often give is just with the domestic cat. In many places, the domestic cat is a introduced non-indigenous species that has a fairly profound impact on birds. But managing them is virtually impossible because of society's relationship or individuals' relationships with cats. And so instead of managing cats how we would manage, say, a rat species or some other mammal, in this case, the management might require public education about keeping cats inside or spaying or neutering them or something like that. And so given that, and there's a lot on the slide, I just want to make a couple of points. Given that it's so complicated to manage species in cities, it's really important then for agencies or organizations that are doing the managing of cities to do certain things. That is, that they should be assessing the social and economic impacts of invasion. They should be engaging with human populations to understand what those impacts would be. They should understand what the perceived benefits are. And then they should have a number of decision triggers or management thresholds that are very clear to say, when species have perceived benefits, they should only be managed under certain circumstances when they have realized a certain amount of negative impact, for example. But there should be clear threshold and triggers. We did a review of many invasive species management programs in cities, and we found that only about 8% had a clear threshold for triggering some management action, and less than half of them actually identified what their priorities were. So it seems like lots of organizations or agencies are going ahead and managing non-native species in cities, but haven't really been clear about what triggers those management decisions, how they engage with human populations in cities. And so it seems like what it appears to be the case is that for some places in the world, agencies are applying their management strategies from natural areas to cities. And this is leading to conflict with human populations. And so there needs to be more developed guidelines and clearer frameworks for managing species in cities. All right, so that's sort of a broad overview of what's happening with cities and invasions. And now I'm going to start to do a bit of a deeper dive into some of our own projects to answer some specific questions. And as we move from these general global patterns of invasion to local non-indigenous species success and impact, we need to start to think about the ways in which species are successful in cities. And what we can think of, if we look at this figure right here, this is just a classic figure that many plant ecologists would know of. And it's just basically, each of these dots is a species globally. And they're organized in this multivariate space based on a whole bunch of measured traits of those species. And what we know is that globally, there's sort of this trait space that's occupied by species. And we know that some species are relatively unique So they may have extremely large leaves and large seeds, and some of them may be really quite tiny plants. But we know there's different hotspots of plants, of woody plants and herbaceous plants. So we know how species are distributed in their niche space globally. But as we think about cities, we think that are cities selecting for certain kinds of species based on their traits? So we could ask, are cities just random sampling of this global trait space, or are they biasing this trait space in some ways? Are they selecting species because cities are a simpler environment that allow for species that are competing for a simpler niche space? Are they selecting for species that are dissimilar in some key attributes? Are cities driving trait space in certain non-random directions? And this is a direction that some of the research I'm currently undertaking is pursuing, and I'll say a bit more about this later on. But we also need to know whether or not those non-native species that are coming into cities are successful because they're either dissimilar from those native species that might occur in cities, or are they similar to those successful species, right? And this is something we don't really understand very well. Are species that are coming into cities being successful because they possess distinct traits or they're evolutionarily unique? Or are they coming in because they share key similarities to those species already found in cities? And this distinction between whether species are dissimilar from or similar to the species in a habitat goes all the way back to Charles Darwin, who first articulated this idea that there are multiple ways that non-indigenous species could be successful. And so in order to understand this, we actually need to not only understand how the species is unique or dissimilar to those local habitats, but what kind of impact is it having on those communities as well. And this is where I'll show you some of our specific research. And so we can look at a urban system like here in Toronto, and this photo is of a dominant invader. It's called Vincentoscum rossicum. You'll see me refer to it as dog strangling vine. I'll talk a little bit more about its biology in a minute. But we see species like this becoming really widespread in cities, more so than in natural areas. And so we need to understand why it's being so successful. And so in these contexts, there's three ways that a species can be a successful invader. And so if we think about this plant community here, and we see these two native species, and our invasive species is going to be in gold, right? We know if it invades a certain community, we can ask some really simple questions. One is it successful because it occupies unique niche space? So it has unique traits. It's able to access unique resources, especially in the urban context. And so it's complementing those other species that are already there. So here we have a unique species. Or it could be successful because it has a higher realized fitness. It's just better than those resident species in that specific context. And so in the first case, we'd say that species should stably coexist with the other resident species. In the second case, we should see competitive exclusion. We should see that invasive species is removing other species from the system. There is a third option, which is that invasive species alters niche space. That is that it's relatively unique, but it drives a system towards its set of traits. It may be altering the environment in some way that favors itself, that then favors dissimilar species. So it's not competing against the most similar species. It's removing niche space from dissimilar species. And an example of this could be that in an open system, a species comes in that creates a lot of shade that alters the environment for other species. And so some species are able to persist with that new light environment, and others are not because it's a different set of conditions. Similarly, species might alter below ground chemistry or nutrient cycling that or pH that changes the environment in some way against certain species. And we call this one an ecosystem modifier. And so why this is important in urban areas especially is that these changes that urbanization creates could change the relationships between these species. So we might be moving systems from one in which native and non-indigenous species can coexist into ones where there's competition, right? So urban areas may be simplifying niche space to forcing more competition. They may be creating new niche opportunities for species to come in that are ecosystem modifiers. But the point is that urbanization may be shifting systems in ways that tip the balance towards non-indigenous species. So this is just to set up this one study system that my lab has been working in for about 10 years. We work in urban woodlots and meadows in the city of Toronto. And we are specifically interested in this one species, Vincitoscum rossicum. It's referred to in Canada as dog strangling vine. You can see in the photo here of me walking with one of my students that it forms dense monocultures, especially in urban areas. And it forms these dense monocultures where we may not see many other species. And I'll say a little bit about that in a moment. And so we've been working on this quite a bit to understand the ways in which it's successful and the ways in which that it impacts local diversity in urban systems. And we've done a lot of research in it, but I'm going to go through a very high level of some of our major findings to tell the story of why the species is successful and why it's having such impact. So this species, dog strangling vine, was first introduced in Toronto in North America and was brought in purposely by people. It was thought to be a unique species that had some unique attributes, and it was also thought that it could, because it grows quickly, it could do very well in disturbed areas. And in its native range, which is in Ukraine and Russia, it's actually not very abundant. And so it has higher abundance and a bigger range in North America than it does in its native range. So it's really benefiting from the conditions here. In Toronto, it was originally introduced into the sort of the core of the city down here, the dark circles, and over time spread, especially to the east part of the city. Right now I'm talking to you from this location right here, which is basically surrounded by this invasive species. And we see this massive increase over time. So it was first introduced in the mid 1800s. And really started to spread rapidly around 1950, 1960. This figure might be biased just by sampling effort from herbaria, from a local herbarium, but the story is undoubtedly true that there's been an exponential increase in its spread through the 1900s. So we do a lot of work at the eastern part of the city of Toronto in a national park called the Rouge National Urban Park. And we use this as sort of our laboratory because it's surrounded by urbanization on both sides of the park. And to the north, it's actually has a lot of agriculture as well. So we get a sense of a lot of different types of human land use in the system. And we see a lot of different pressures and stressors on the system as well. So in this park, we've been monitoring approximately 500 plots across the park, across more than 20 sites. And we purposely selected these sites across a gradient of invasion from dog strangling vine. And so some sites in the park look like this that are heavily invaded, almost monocultures of our invasive plant. And other places in the park look like this that are much more diverse, much more healthy. And you can see that in some places in the park, if I put down a 1 by 1 meter plot, I might only count 3 to 5 species that when it's dominated by the invasive plant. Other parts of the park we'll see about 15 species in a meter squared. So very different diversities. And we selected our sites across the park based on the relative a percent cover of dog stranding vine, of our invasive plant, from places where it's almost non-existent in the park to places that it's very, very abundant. And we think of this as essentially a space for time substitution. These are likely parts of the park where it has been present for a couple of decades at least, and these are parts of the park where it's probably newly established. So in order to understand why it's successful, we need to understand a little bit about its similarities and differences to other species. And as plant ecologists, what we would like to know is how is its niche similar to or different than other species? Does it occupy unique niche space? Is it doing things in different ways than other species? But it's very difficult to measure a niche of a species. So what we do is we use indirect measures based on the traits of species. So we'll measure a suite of different traits that have to do with its overall growth, leaf traits, reproductive traits, etc., in order to understand how similar or different it is to other species in the system. Another approach we take is that we will measure how closely related it is evolutionarily, or how similar it is genetically to other species in the system. And we use this approach to identify species that might be more distinct than others. And this is referred to as phylogenetic diversity. So you might hear me use these two terms, functional and phylogenetic diversity, just to mean these indirect ways to measure the similarity and differences between our exotic plant to our other ones in the system. And the way we view these ecosystems is basically like this, is that the impact of our invasive plant as it becomes more abundant is going to impact a number of different aspects of plant diversity in the ecosystem. So it is going to impact, for example, the functional diversity, so the types of traits that species have in these systems. It's going to affect composition, richness, phylogenetic diversity, and then those impacts on diversity are then going to have impacts on the functioning of these ecosystems. And the functioning of these ecosystems is very important in an urban context because these ecosystems supply services to people. So whether that's sequestering carbon dioxide, providing habitat for pollinators, pest control, nutrient cycling, etc. And so we're really interested in these linkages between the presence or increase in abundance of an exotic species, the impacts on diversity, and the impacts on ecosystem function. So we'll look at this first part first, the impacts on biodiversity. So what we're hypothesizing is that the increase in the abundance of dog strangling vine negatively impacts biodiversity. And when that's the case, I'll show using a red color. But it's also possible that DSV, dog strangling vine, could be impacting diversity in positive ways, and I'll show that in purple. So we have a number of different ways of measuring diversity, as I alluded to in the last slide. So functional, compositional, taxonomic, phylogenetic, etc. And what we find is that as we see increases in the abundance of dog strangling vine, we see decreases in biodiversity measured in multiple ways. We see very significant decreases in species richness and functional diversity. But importantly, we see that the relative proportion of native species in the system is highly negatively impacted, but the relative proportion of other exotic species in the system increases with DSV. So we see it that it is altering the system. We're seeing decreases in diversity, but we are seeing shifts in the kinds of species that are there. So let's think a little bit more about what's happening. So on the left side of this panel are just those three hypotheses I introduced earlier, where the exotic species shown in gold either occupies unique niche space, or it's a superior competitor and occupies niche space overlapping with potential residents. And then the final hypothesis is that it occupies unique niche space, but it's shifting the community in a very specific way. So how can we test these hypotheses if we're not measuring niches directly? Well, we take three different trait-based measures. One, shown in the blue dashed line here, is we can just look at the average trait value of the community. And so what we might take is, for example, average height of the community or average leaf size. And we can ask, how does the invasion of DSV change that trait size? And so, for example, if our invader is right in the middle of our niche space, it shouldn't change the average trait value because it's fitting right into the average of the community. So as DSV abundance increases, we shouldn't see any change in the community weighted mean trait value. So we see the straight blue line. The second measure we can look at is the range of trait values. So what's the total diversity of trait values? And again, if our invader is well within the range of the community, again, we should see no change in its overall range of trait values. However, if this invasive species is a dominant competitor, it will be disproportionately impacting those species that are most similar to it. So the species that are lost from the system are those that should overlap in its traits. So we should see then, in this case, as we increase the abundance of, as we look at species that are more similar to DSV in their traits, down here, should have lower abundances, and the species that are more dissimilar from an invader should have higher abundances. Whereas when the species occupies unique trait space, we should see that the average trait value and the trait range should be increasing, but we shouldn't see much of an impact of trait distance because it's occupying unique trait space and it's stably coexisting. Whereas when the species coming in is unique and changes the system, we should see that we see perhaps a decline in trait space as the community becomes more restricted in its traits, the types of traits that can occur there. We should see a change in the average trait value. And we should see the inverse here, where species that are dissimilar to DSV in their traits might actually have lower abundance because they're out here in trait space and they're being selected against. I'm not going to show you all the data because this is has been a lot of work, but I'm just going to jump to the punchline right here, which is that it appears to be the third case is the one that we see with DSV. And so it's coming into these urban systems as a unique species. It doesn't have a lot of trait overlap with resident species, but once it becomes abundant, it seems to be driving communities in a particular direction. And we take that with the previous result where we see this increase in exotic species in the system and decrease in native species. What it's doing is it's selecting for certain subsets of exotic species that have traits more similar to DSV. So it seems to be creating an environment that's more hospitable to these other exotic species. And we do this in two different habitats within the city, both open meadow habitats and forest understory habitats. And we do this because the forest understory already has a more restricted niche axis in terms of light availability. And when we do this, we don't see that effect of DSV. It still becomes abundant. It seems to be competing with some species, but it doesn't seem to be shifting the ecosystem or have an engineering effect that it does in the open habitat systems. We've looked at the mechanisms of impact of how this dominant exotic species seems to be having these impacts. And the one thing I'll say on this is that we can divide measures based on traits and its impacts, say, on soil and environment. And we can assess how those directly impact resident diversity. And what we find, just as an overall picture, is that the hot colors, the ones in red and orange, are the measures of direct competition, and the cool colors are those that seem to be modifications to the environment, the ways in which it's changing the environment to have these indirect impacts and these ecosystem modifications. What we found overall is they're about 50-50. So about 50% of the impact of the species seems to be through some degree of competition, and this is largely driven by forest understories. And about 50% of its impact seems to be through these indirect modifications on the local environments as well. So it seems to have these profound impacts that alter the system to a great degree. So we know that this species is having these large-scale impacts on diversity. So species, our invasive species comes in, and as it becomes more abundant, we're losing native species. So we know that. And it's doing it through modifications to the local environment, as well as some competition. But now the next question is, does it matter for ecosystem level processes? So we know that we're seeing changes in the diversity in these communities. So we're seeing declines, for example, in species richness. We're seeing declines in functional diversity. We might say changes in certain trait values that maybe are not declines. And what we want to know then is, as these changes in diversity occur, are there impacts in ecosystem function? So, for example, the amount of carbon that's being sequestered in these ecosystems, is that changing with changes in diversity? Is the support for pollinators changing? Is the support for nutrient cycling changing because of these declines in abundance? And so, it's really not clear. And the reason why it's not clear is because, as you saw in those photos, this species that we study becomes very abundant. So is it able to compensate for the ecosystem function that is impacted by the loss of native biodiversity? And so the reason why it's so abundant is that we know that it's released from natural enemies. It has a number of toxic chemicals in its leaves that deter native herbivores. And so because it has this really high fitness, is it able to just compensate and say sequester as much carbon dioxide as would have been in the native system? And so that increased fitness, we think, should increase the ecosystem function. But at the same time, because it's getting rid of native species, because it's altering the environment of the ecosystem, and we're losing niche space, we're losing unique native species, we're losing those species that may be providing unique contributions to ecosystem function. So now when we look at the ecosystem functioning across these plots that we study, what we see again in red is a number of ecosystem functions seem to be negatively impacted. We see less pollinators, both in terms of richness and abundance. We see fewer flowers, especially at a certain time of year. We see less plant litter. We actually see lower above ground biomass, even though that vine looks so abundant and so widespread. We're actually losing species that might be filling in space beneath their canopy. We might be losing species that are able to that are larger in size or are able to coexist at a smaller scale than these dog-stranding vine monocultures. So we see these declines. The one thing we see an increase in is nitrogen use, and that's likely because the species decomposes so quickly. There's a change in the nitrogen cycling that corresponds with it, and that other species are not able to access nitrogen as efficiently. But overall, we see this decline in ecosystem function, which again, in this urban park is really profoundly important because of the services it provides in this highly modified landscape. So we're ending up with these natural systems in urban areas, these green spaces that we know provide important ecosystem services that are now seeing decreasing function because of this invasion. And so, so this would be a case where there's a strong motivation to try to control and remove this species, which is actually a really difficult thing. And I'm happy to discuss that in questions. So the story about this so far is that we know that this invasive species reduces diversity. It's occupying relatively unique niche space, but it's altering communities and removing niche space from other types of species. We also know, and I haven't shown it here, that it's homogenizing communities. So it's creating the same communities in different places in the city. And we know now that these diversity declines are resulting in consequences to ecosystem function. But this is just a story about one invader in one place. And now I'm going to take a quick scale back out and just tell you about a project that we're now pursuing to understand how cities around the world are facilitating and being impacted by invasion. So about 5 years ago, I created something called the Global Urban Biological Invasions Consortium, or GUBIC. And what it is it's a network of researchers working on urban invasions and coming up with ways to answer key questions about the roles of cities in invasions, to develop collaboration, to provide policy guidance as well. And now includes more than 120 researchers in 30 countries around the world. A number of papers has just started coming out from these collaborations, but there's a lot of work that's being done right now. But the research objectives of this are to assess the influence of urban to rural gradients in human impact, economics, environment, to understand the impacts on invasive species population sizes and diversity, to determine how political, economic, trade, and environmental differences among cities influence the invasibility of cities, to quantify ecosystem services and disservices provided by non-indigenous species within and among cities, and to think about the policy and management decision triggers in different types of cities and different socioeconomic conditions. So we've compiled a data set that now includes more than 13,000 species observations in more than 550 cities. We have more than 96,000 or close to 100,000 occurrence records across all these different cities. And what we're really trying to understand is the ways in which cities and urbanization select for species non-randomly, how those non-random selection of species are altering the niche makeup of cities. So where in niche space are cities sitting? Where are they pushing species towards? And how is that going to impact ecosystem functioning? And so this is just a hypothesis that we're developing the data to test right now. But what we think is happening is that those different factors that we can measure cities on, so how isolated a city is, how connected it is to global transportation hubs, how old a city is, how big a city is, how culturally diverse a city is, those may all be factors that drive the selection of species. And so we might be able to predict, given a city's age, its maybe its cultural diversity, its degree of trade with other cities, the kinds of species that'll be there and how biodiversity is being shaped in that city, and ultimately how that diversity is going to be providing ecosystem functioning and services to people that live in those cities. So look forward to much more work coming out on the interaction between cities and invasions globally. This is an area that we're going to be pursuing heavily in the next few years. And with that, I'm happy to acknowledge lots of different people that have worked through my lab that have contributed to these various projects. And I guess if there's time, I'm happy to take questions as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mark, for a wonderful talk. So it's question time. So I would like to introduce you with Mark. We have two platforms. One is this Zoom platform. The other one is, I don't know, 扣钱英语怎么说呢? Another Chinese platform. There are around 400 people in another platform to attend this seminar.
Great. So maybe I'll stop sharing so I can take questions.
Yeah, okay.
There you go.
So Mark, maybe I have the first question. So I think it's a wonderful talk. My concern is you propose the three measures to quantify the invasion, and then, but what I'm interested in mostly is you mentioned only 80%. Let me see. You mentioned in a urban ecosystem, only 80% has a clear threshold. That for how to say for triggering management action. So I mean, which means we do not have a clear understanding about the threshold to what extent. I mean, the clear threshold. I mean, for what kind of action need to be triggered to manage the biodiversity. So I think this is a very key, very important question. I mean, for the how to say for urban management. I mean, for example, how many garden we should have, how many plant. I mean, the trees we could have. So I mean, what kind of the how to say the theory or the suggestion you think you can have for this policy makers?
Mhm. Yeah, that's in some ways that is the key question. So we've been working with local agencies here for a couple of years, and we've developed a prioritization tool for them or with them that basically keeps a list of all the non-native species that have been observed, and from this uses information that's available about those species in terms of their life history, their ecological impact, their contributions or impacts on ecosystem services, and comes up with a way to quantify and rank species according to the prioritization. So we've been working with them to develop a transparent and repeatable way to prioritize species. And that was actually just published this year in Journal of Applied Ecology, that tool. And so we hope to develop it to use in cities anywhere. But the second part of that, so one part is to have priorities. So we know that, these three species have to be controlled. The other is the management threshold, is that threshold, which is to say, when do you control it? And the problem that we see in any place in the world when it comes to non-native species is that management threshold tends to be when things are already too late. When, like, for example, if you think about the dog strangling vine in the city, it's all across the city of Toronto, very, very high abundances. Maybe 50 years ago, it could have been controlled when it was just in a few populations. And so we need to have a more responsive set of thresholds that not only look at the total abundance or impact, but look for some increase over time. So there needs to be monitoring. So if you see, for example, that a population is increasing by 10% per year, that even though it's small population now, the fact that it's increasing should be the decision threshold, not its impact necessarily. So we're trying to work with organizations as well to develop some of those, the logic of some of those thresholds and when an organization should act to remove species. That's a little bit controversial for a lot of reasons, but we're trying to work on that. And there should be accepted rules around the world, but currently there's not.
So I think this is a wonderful point. I think it just reminded me how to connect this threshold value, quantification of this threshold value to your, three measures. I think your three measures is really wonderful. But my concern is now is a big data time. So we can use lots of the intelligent AI, artificial intelligence to directly measure the many plant traits, like the photosynthetic rate, like the height. A long time ago, we need to go feed and then measure by lots of labor consuming the work. But now I think is that possible? And do you think this kind of the landscape study would be changed by the big data area? So I mean, we do not necessarily go there. We just use the plane or remote sensing techniques to just directly measure the loss of the plant trait, and then get. I mean, from this kind of the perspective, what do you predict your? I mean, the research field in this. I mean, in this area.
Yeah, that's a good question. So we now have through global databases the traits available for 100,000 plant species. So information is there. We can, if we know the composition of any place, we can come up with measures that that tell us how unique a species is relative to other species. Where we're lacking data to make these types of rapid decisions is on the ground data in cities. And one of our sub projects right now is actually using Google Street View. So in many places in the world, you have these Google cars that drive around and take photos of along the street. It was historically used for navigation, but we're using AI to we're trying to implement AI to go through Google Street View images to look at the plant communities and to start to make these assessments. And the nice thing about it is that Google Street View now has multiple years of data. So you can go back and you can look where species have been spreading and increasing in abundance. And that might be the first way to trigger some sort of, not necessarily a management response, but trigger those species of that area for maybe on the ground assessment. So someone goes in and takes a look and sees if that's the case, and then that could trigger a management decision. So yeah, so like you say, there's a lot there for automating globally some of these processes. We just need to make sure that the data works to do this.
So there is one question from the chat room. Can you see that it is there?
Yeah. So the question is there any example of successful management of such an invasion? Yeah, there have been. They usually involve some sort of biocontrol. So releasing an insect, specialized insect or set of insects that that reduce the reproductive rate of these species. There's no management that completely removes species, except for on islands, where the area is relatively constrained. But in large continental areas, there's really no examples of completely removing species. So what you have to hope for is some sort of management that reduces the reproductive success, so they're less competitive against native species. And as I said, the best way to do that with plants has been the release of biocontrol. We have examples in Toronto of some species that have really been reduced through biocontrol. There has been a biocontrol, a moth called Hypena opulenta that's been released for the dog strangling vine that we have, but it hasn't seemed yet to have much of an impact. So yeah, it's it takes years to develop these management solutions. Some people are looking into more extreme technologies like CRISPR-Cas9 gene drive and stuff to try to get these back. But and that's another thing about urban areas as well, is you have limitation in your control measures because it's very difficult to do prescribed burns. So you can't really use fire in cities. It's very difficult to do massive spraying of herbicides or pesticides in cities because of potential health impacts. And so you're really restricted in cities in the type of management, and having people go in and just pull plants out or remove them physically is usually not feasible.
So Mark, there's one more question from the Chen Jun.
So the question is, I was wondering, when assessing ecosystem functions, whether we've looked into microbial communities and their changes upon invasion. The short answer is yes, we have. It's still just early on. So we've done sequencing of soil, and we've also have started doing some plant soil feedback experiments as well. So we take soil from invaded areas and from non-invaded areas and grow different plants to see what kind of feedback there is. And so there are changes to the microbial community. What our next set of experiments are investigating is that the doxylamine vine impacts the soil through two ways. One is through the alteration of the microbial communities, and the other is biochemistry. So it releases an alkaloid called anthophyne in fairly large amounts into the soil, and this might have direct allelopathic effect on plants, while at the same time it may be affecting microbial communities. So we're trying to carry out experiments that try to separate these two effects: the direct effect of the chemical changes on native plants versus the effect of changes to the microbial communities on the germination and growth of native plants. So we've been carrying those experiments out for the past year, but nothing to report yet. We're still analyzing data, but that is what we feel is one of the major ways that the species impacts native communities is below ground through soil.
So I would like to follow this question, Mark. Do you think the more phylogenetically close to each other for plant community, and then the more genetically more close to its, their how to say, rhizosphere microbial community? Do you have sort of the data?
So we don't have. So one thing is that this species really doesn't have any close relative in our system. Its closest relative is a milkweed, but it's still fairly distantly related. But what we wonder, so it's one of two effects, we think. One is on the symbiotic mutualists, effect on symbiotic mutualists, that the doxylamine vine might be cultivating certain mutualists that may not be of much benefit to many of the native species. But the other is that it may be changing pathogen communities. And in that case, it probably doesn't share pathogens very much with native species because it doesn't have close related species. But we think it may be just altering the pathogen communities in such a way that they're more likely to impact groups of closely related native species. So its impact of DSV may not be on close related species, but it may have impact on groups of close related species, either through soil microbes or changing some of that soil chemistry. So groups of close related species may be similarly sensitive to the species.
So Mark, maybe I have one silly question. My opinion is a human being probably are the most successful invader of the urban city. So I think that now you are doing such kind of study, you are just like we call about the ecosystem service. Lots of this, it's just a working service for people, for human beings. So my question is, do you have some kind of the time series the data? For example, I just remember my hometown. My hometown is a small city, and 40 years ago there are very little, high building. But now with time, there are lots of the very beautiful street, very beautiful buildings, and the city is constantly changing. And then I think the invasion species and the local native species probably is also the constantly changing. So what's the best, in your opinion, what's the best, how to say, the best condition or best about the ecosystem structure for this kind of the city, or maybe it depends on the size of population size, or it depends on the how to say. So I mean, for each city, like you talk about the urban ecosystem, I think that for different different city has different priority. Some city probably is just more agriculture. Some city probably more digital industry. And so what's the best, I mean, the ecosystem structure and function? And how many, as you mentioned, maybe a quarter of the species are non-native, maybe like 27% or 40%. So what's the best condition? What's the best composition in your opinion? Can you give us an example? I mean, I'm not so sure. My question, it's a silly question.
No, I get it. It's ultimately it's the most important question. Well, I guess I'd start off with the first part you said about humans being the most successful invasive species. What I would say is what defines an invasive species is not only its spread, but also its impact. So, we also, as an invasive species, we have the unique ability to try to reduce our impact. So we can actually become less invasive by changing how we do things. So in that way, we're a very unique invasive species. We can change our impact and make ourselves less invasive. So in a city, I mean, we don't have really good time series data for vegetation in cities. We have some herbaria that have good specimens and records, but we don't have good spatial data. But right now there's a bit of a debate still in whether cities are better off with land sparing or land sharing. And what that means is that land sparing says, is it better to concentrate people into small areas and have areas, relatively large areas that are protected, that are natural? Or is it better to have people more dispersed, less dense, and more small green areas, land sharing? And I think most of the evidence suggests that land sparing is better. So having bigger, more intact areas, even though you can have benefits from lots of little green spaces, for sure, but we realize more benefits from intact, larger habitats. And so I think optimally what we want to see in cities eventually is the growth of green space. So as cities grow, to accommodate large amounts of green space that's relatively intact. So whether we're restoring or conserving, we're making sure that there's intact habitats within cities. And but also, at a smaller scale, where people live, we do want them to have access and realize the benefits from green space. So it's really thinking smartly about how cities grow and develop and making sure that there's ample space for green space. And to my mind, what an optimal city looks like is having these large green spaces, but in places where people live is having lots of green spaces integrated into their lives. So maybe it's like green roofs where people can grow plants or do agriculture. It's green walls on the sides of buildings where plants are growing. It's street trees that create shade canopies down streets. It's making sure that all this green is integrated as much as possible into the places where people live and work.
So, but I'm afraid I'm not very much agree with you about the human being occupy the unique niche. I think that, like, for example, when we invade a city, very likely we cut some trees, and then so I would like to say this would be like the competitive exclusion. So because if we cut the tree is not going to grow anymore. So I think people are more damaging.
Well, yes, but if you think, for example, like certain pollution, so 50 years ago, part of our niche of impact included this chemical pollution over large areas, and in many places in the world, the law that chemical pollution has been banned, and so we've been able to reduce some impacts. And so that's what I mean by our unique position is that will always have negative impact. Our activity always has negative impact, but we can try to reduce some of that impact. Even as our numbers become more abundant, we could, producing less carbon dioxide, less pollution, being more efficient with space and food production, we could reduce our impact. And so that's the only opportunity that we have.
Yeah, I fully agree. I think this is probably why you initiate the general, called ecological solution evidence. I think it's very important that human beings, just to reduce the competition so we can coexist with other species. So there are also one more question in the chat room. It is, can you see this one?
The bottom one is, can you give advice about the trade-offs between ecological function of invasive species, such as Spartina anglica, and their invasive adverse effects? So some species do provide ecosystem function benefits. So they might provide habitat for other species. They could provide, for example, stabilization of soil. They could be more resistant to chemical pollution, and so can maintain carbon sequestration in adversely affected areas. And so to understand those non-native species or invasive species in cities, we do need to account for both those benefits and then the negative impacts on, say, biodiversity and other ecosystem functions. And so earlier I mentioned the prioritization tool that we've developed. That takes into account both the ecosystem benefits of a species and its negative impacts, and tries to come up with what is a balance. And it all depends on what people value more. If they value, if they put more value on losing biodiversity than, say, carbon sequestration, they might come up with one conclusion about the impact or the need to control a species. But if they, for example, value carbon sequestration more than local loss of biodiversity, they might come up with a different decision. So it's really up to the priorities of the agency. And I don't think we have any universally accepted rules about how to navigate that trade-off between the benefits and the negative impacts. It really does depend on the context and the magnitude of those impacts.
So Mark, I just have the direct opinion. I'm doing lots of the agriculture ecosystem. So suddenly I feel that agriculture is kind of another kind of the invasive species. So you see, if we do the corn, the wheat, we wish there's only one species over there. And the other species, the diversity is as low as possible. But still we can have the sustainable agriculture. So I mean, you propose the three measures. You think that? So I mean, what do you think? What you think that? I mean, if I purposely want to integrate your three measures into this agriculture ecosystem, you think which measures is better fitted in?
In the case of agriculture, this is a system where competition is severely reduced by human activity, and if human activity was stopped, those agricultural fields would disappear quickly. Other species would take over, and so in that case, it's kind of like almost like a fourth option, which is that niche space has been constricted so much to just one species, and the fitness of other species have basically been reduced to zero. And it's such an artificial system. There is, as you're aware, there are moves to create more sustainable agriculture and think about agro-ecosystems, and to think about how to include biodiversity in agricultural systems. But at the end of the day, we do have to feed 8 billion people And so there has to be, some trade-off accepted, that there's certain areas of land that we're going to use solely for food production. And so maybe one of the ways to become more sustainable is to become more efficient on those places we already grow food, to become more productive, more efficient, while setting aside other areas and protecting it from agricultural expansion. At the end of the day, that's the only optimal solution.
Yeah, I think so. So I think in agriculture we need to apply the more ecological theory into the agriculture study. So that's very interesting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So I think another thing, like the other guy he mentioned about the microbe community, I think that your principle, could be applied into the diversity and function relationship study for the microbe community. I think that's really a fascinating area.
Thank you.
So there are many questions, but in another platform, and then we saw they will send you the email. If they have more questions, so in the chat room, I think we have the last question. It's about the biodiversity is a priority. Do you want to answer this question?
Well, I think it was in response to what I was answering to the other question, where I said that it depends on the local management agencies, whether the priority is biodiversity conservation or the priority is some sort of ecosystem function. And at a global scale, biodiversity is the priority. We can't keep on losing species. And so at local scales, we might think that we're willing to accept loss of biodiversity, and humans have been accepting that all over the world. Every time we plant an agricultural field, every time we expand a city, but all those biodiversity losses add up to a global biodiversity loss. And so I feel like for too long we haven't valued biodiversity at a small scale as much as we should. We've always thought that it exists somewhere else. It'll be fine, but it hasn't been. And so I would like to see. And I think this is the case in many cities around the world, that biodiversity has become more important in the management of green space and thinking about conservation within cities and trying to ensure there's maximum biodiversity. But that's certainly something that needs to be developed further.
So, yeah, thank you very much. I think, Mark, that's a wonderful talk. I think that I fully agree with you. You see, the biodiversity is low, probably in New York City, in Toronto, in Shanghai, but the economically more developed. But globally speaking, probably the diversity is more important. But this reminds me of one thing: the human being is just one species. So we are only the one species, and also there are lots of the plant species. For microbe diversity is extremely high. So. But one species, I think, is dominant this planet. So it's hard to say. I think that I have no question, but I think, yeah, I fully agree with you. So sometimes the diversity at the regional scale probably is important, but it depends on the scale.
Yeah, I completely agree.
Mm-hmm. So maybe, Mark, so many people probably will send you email because their question is another platform. Sorry, I could not get access to over there, and also it's almost 1.5 hours. Thank you very much for your talk.
Well, thank you very much for having me. Thank you, everyone, for the great questions.
So I hope the pandemic. I think in Canada probably it's already there is no lockdown. The pandemic is already gone in Toronto, or you're already no problem over there.
Well, there's still problem. There's still rules, but we've opened up in many ways. But people still have to be vaccinated, and in certain places you still have to wear masks. So there's still good rules in place, but the virus is still here, and people are still getting sick, but not as much as before.
But I think that for most people, there are no, maybe even though he or she is infected, but no serious symptoms.
Yeah, I think people who've been vaccinated are experiencing less severe symptoms. And unfortunately, in Canada, we have very, very high vaccination rate. So we don't see very many people getting very sick anymore. So as long as people keep getting vaccinated and get their boosters, then I think the worst of it is over.
Yeah, I think so. In China, also, it's the same thing happens. For example, I think in past 2 months, and we somehow very strictly limited for moving around. But I heard that more than 90% of the infection is no symptom. So which means that this virus, still is popular, but not very severe. So
So
hopefully at the end of this year, this virus is completely gone. So that's caused a lot of the problem for conference, for traveling. So
yeah, I hope so too. We need to get back to normal.
How many times you have been in China? So you went to the Zhejiang province, Hangzhou, with the Chen Wei?
Yeah, I've been to China, I think 4 different times. But one time I was in Guangzhou for 9 months. I was there for quite a while.
But in Guangzhou for Dr. Sun Yat-sen University over there?
Yeah, exactly.
I know there is a very good the school of the ecology. I remember in the Dr. Sun Yat-sen University. That's wonderful. I have several friends over there.
It's a beautiful campus. I like it there.
Yeah. So I'm now in the northeastern China. It's most of the black soil. It's a place where most of black soil is located. So I remember in Canada also it's one place where there are lots of the black soil, molly soil over there. Do you think that in Canada there are lots of the molly soil over there, black soil?
I mean, Canada's very rich in good quality soil, but I don't know relative to China, which has more. I don't know.
It's in dark color. It's in dark color or brown color, or it's.
Yeah. So here it's in this region it's very organic, so it tends to be very dark brown, almost black.
Okay.
Yeah.
So thank you very much.
Thank you.
So thank you very much.
Okay. Bye-bye. Have a good evening.
You too. Have a good morning. Good day.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
唐老师，那我们就到了这个地方了，是吧？
好的，可以结束了，张老师，辛苦你了。
哎呀，不行，他这个未来再如果提问的话，就是在另外那个叫什么平台就没办法提问，是吧？
他们可以提问，但是我们可以转，就是不能直接提问，就是需要我们从那个平台转过来。
哦，那你们怎么没有把他们的问题转一些？或怎么转过来？转过来就 copy 到这个聊天室里吗？
对，他们现在没有太具体的问题，所以就没有转，就是还是这边的问题为主吧。
你这边给我们出难题啊，我们其实也不太，对马可这个领域也不太懂。
很好了，很好了。哦，行，那如果可以的话，我就那个了，关